I sat in the lawyer's office, trying to make sense of what he had just told me. My fingers trembled as I clutched the thick manila envelope in my hands. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" I asked, certain I had misheard. Mr. Daniels peered at me over his wire-rimmed glasses, his weathered face a mask of professional detachment. "As per your husband's last will and testament, Mrs. Holloway, he has left the entirety of his estate to you. The house, his investments, the family business, everything." A strangled gasp from across the room drew my attention. Margaret Holloway, my mother-in-law, sat rigid in her chair, her face contorted in rage and disbelief. "This cannot be right," she hissed, her voice trembling. "James would never leave everything to her." She spat the last word like it was poison on her tongue. "I assure you, Mrs. Holloway, the will is quite clear," Mr. Daniels replied, unruffled by her outburst. "Your son's wishes were explicitly stated." Margaret's eyes, the same piercing blue as James's had been, fixed on me with such hatred that I instinctively recoiled. "You manipulated him," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "You waited until he was weak and vulnerable, and you manipulated him." "Margaret, I don't." She stood abruptly, gathering her designer purse with shaking hands. "This isn't over, Rebecca. I don't know how you did it, but I will not let you steal my son's legacy." With that, she stormed out, the door slamming behind her with enough force to rattle the framed law degrees on the wall. I exhaled slowly, the breath I'd been holding escaping in a shuddering rush. 3 weeks since James's funeral, and the pain was still raw, a gaping wound that refused to heal. And now this. "Mrs. Holloway, Rebecca," Mr. Daniels said gently, drawing me back to the present. "I understand this is a difficult time. But there's something else you should know." He slid a sealed envelope across the desk. My name was written on it in James's unmistakable handwriting. "Your husband left this for you. He asked that it be given to you privately, after the reading of the will." I stared at the envelope, a lump forming in my throat. James's final words to me. With trembling fingers, I slipped it into my bag. "Thank you," I managed, rising from my chair on unsteady legs. "Of course. And Rebecca," he added as I reached the door, "for what it's worth, James was very clear about his wishes. He knew exactly what he was doing." I nodded, unable to speak past the knot in my throat, and stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight. The world continued to turn, oblivious to the fact that mine had been shattered beyond recognition. Margaret's sleek black Mercedes was nowhere to be seen in the parking lot. Small mercies. As I fumbled for my car keys, my phone began to vibrate in my pocket. I glanced at the screen and immediately felt my stomach clench. Margaret. Again. I let it go to voicemail, as I had done with the dozen other calls since James's death. Each message was more venomous than the last, accusations of how I had never been good enough for her precious son. How I had trapped him. How I had ruined his life. And now, with the revelation of the will, those accusations would only intensify. I slid into the driver's seat and sat there, the envelope burning a hole in my bag. I wasn't ready to read it. Not yet. Not when the mere sight of his handwriting was enough to make my chest constrict with grief. Starting the engine, I pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward the home that was now solely mine. The home that Margaret had never approved of, deeming it too small and modest for her son. He should be living in Hawthorne Heights, not this starter home, she'd remarked during her first visit, eyeing our beloved craftsman with thinly veiled disdain. James had squeezed my hand under the table, a silent apology for his mother's sharp tongue. We like it here, he had replied simply, and the subject was dropped. But that had set the tone for my relationship with Margaret Holloway. From the moment James had introduced me, a kindergarten teacher from a middle-class family, as his girlfriend, she had made it abundantly clear that I was not the woman she had envisioned for her son. Not wealthy enough. Not ambitious enough. Not Holloway material. And yet, James had loved me. Had chosen me. Had married me, despite his mother's cold disapproval. And now, in his final act, he had left me everything. Everything that Margaret had no doubt assumed would return to her control after her son's passing. The thought made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. What had James been thinking? He had to have known what this would do, how his mother would react. As I pulled into my driveway, I spotted a figure sitting on the porch steps. For a moment, my heart leapt, the familiar silhouette triggering a wave of hope so crushing that I gasped. James. But it wasn't. It couldn't be. It was Daniel, James's younger brother, his lankier frame distinguishable as he rose to greet me. Unlike Margaret, Daniel had always been kind to me. Had welcomed me into the family with genuine warmth. Had stood beside James as his best man at our wedding while Margaret sat stone-faced in the front row. "Rebecca," he said as I approached, his voice gentle. "I heard about the will. Mom called me, she's." Furious, I finished for him, fumbling with my house keys. "I know. That's putting it mildly." He followed me inside, his presence a comfort in the too-quiet house. "You doing okay?" I laughed, the sound hollow even to my own ears. "My husband is dead, and his mother thinks I manipulated him into leaving me everything." "So, no, not really." Daniel's face softened with sympathy. "James knew what he was doing, Becca. He knew exactly how Mom would react." I sank onto the couch, suddenly exhausted. Then why? Why would he do this to me? To us? I gestured vaguely, encompassing the disaster that had become my relationship with my mother-in-law. She already hated me. This just confirms everything she's ever thought about me, that I was after his money. Daniel sat beside me, his expression serious. "James had his reasons. And for what it's worth, Mom didn't always hate you. She was just protective. In her own way." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. Her protection looked an awful lot like contempt. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of James that it made my heart ache. "There's a lot you don't know about our family, Becca. About Mom." He hesitated, as if weighing his words. "Just be careful, okay? Mom can be ruthless when she feels threatened." A chill ran down my spine at his warning. Threatened by what? By me? I never wanted any of this, Daniel. I just wanted James. He squeezed my hand, his eyes sad. "I know. That's why he loved you so much." After Daniel left, I sat in the gathering darkness, the sealed envelope from James resting on the coffee table in front of me. I stared at it, both yearning to read his final words to me and terrified of what they might contain. With shaking hands, I finally opened it, unfolding the pages covered in his familiar script. "My dearest Rebecca," it began. I drew a sharp breath, hearing his voice in my head as if he were sitting right beside me. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone, and you'll know that I've left everything to you. I know this will make things difficult with my mother, and for that, I'm truly sorry. But there are things you need to know. Things I should have told you long ago, but couldn't bring myself to burden you with. My mother is not who you think she is. The Holloway fortune was never truly hers to control, though she spent a lifetime pretending otherwise. As I read his words, the truth of the Holloway family unfolded before me like a dark fairy tale. A legacy of secrets, lies, and ruthless ambition. James had protected me from it all, shielding me from the ugly reality of his family's past. But he couldn't protect me anymore. And with his death, he had thrust me into the heart of a battle I never asked to fight. By the time I finished reading his letter, tears streamed down my face. Not just for James, for the husband I had lost, but for the man I realized I had never fully known. And for the war I now faced against a woman who would stop at nothing to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. Margaret Holloway had hated me from the start. But she had no idea what was coming. The morning after reading James's letter, I woke to the insistent ringing of the doorbell. I'd barely slept, his revelations churning in my mind like a storm-tossed sea. I pulled on a robe and made my way downstairs, already knowing who I would find on the other side of the door. Margaret stood on my porch, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. At 65, she was still strikingly beautiful, her features carved from the same aristocratic mold as her son's. "Rebecca," she said, her voice clipped. "We need to talk." I considered closing the door in her face but thought better of it. This confrontation was inevitable. Better to get it over with. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. She swept past me into the living room, her critical gaze taking in every detail of my home as if cataloging its deficiencies. "I'll be direct," she said, turning to face me. "I want you to renounce your claim to the Holloway assets." I stared at her, momentarily stunned by her audacity. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a document. "I've had my lawyer draw up the papers. Sign them, and I'll ensure you're well compensated for your cooperation." I crossed my arms, anger beginning to simmer beneath my grief. "And why would I do that?" Margaret's perfectly manicured nails tapped against the document in her hand. "Because you and I both know you don't deserve any of this. You were married to my son for less than 3 years. The Holloway fortune has been built over generations. It belongs in the family." "I am family," I said quietly. I was James's wife. Her laugh was cold and brittle. "Please. You were a distraction, nothing more. A phase. If he hadn't gotten sick." "Stop." My voice sharpened, the pain of her words cutting deep. "Don't you dare suggest James didn't love me." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Love? What could you possibly know about love? You're a gold digger who got lucky. James was always too soft-hearted for his own good. Too trusting. But I saw through you from the beginning." The accusation stung, but James's letter had prepared me for this. Had warned me of the lengths his mother would go to protect what she saw as her legacy. "I think you should leave," I said, moving toward the door. Margaret didn't budge. "I'm offering you a clean break, Rebecca. Take it. Because if you force me to fight you on this, I promise you will regret it." The threat hung in the air between us, her words chilling in their certainty. "I'm not signing anything, Margaret," I said. "James wanted me to have everything. I'm honoring his wishes." Her face hardened, the mask of civility slipping to reveal the steel beneath. "You have no idea what you're up against," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "I built the Holloway empire from nothing. After Richard died, it was me, not James, not Daniel, who kept everything together. Everything you think you now own? I created it. Then why did James leave it all to me? I challenged. A flash of uncertainty crossed her features, so brief I almost missed it. Because you manipulated him when he was weak and dying, she spat. But it won't stand. I'll contest the will. I'll drag your name through every court in this country if I have to. She thrust the document at me one more time. Last chance. Sign, or prepare for war. I didn't take it. Get out of my house, Margaret. Her eyes blazed with a hatred so intense that I involuntarily stepped back. You'll regret this, she said, gathering her purse. I promise you that. After she left, I sank onto the couch, my hands trembling. The confrontation had left me drained, but also strangely resolved. James's letter had warned me this would happen. Had prepared me for his mother's reaction. What it hadn't prepared me for was the revelation of what lay beneath the Holloway legacy, a truth so dark that James had kept it from me until the very end. I picked up his letter again, rereading the part that had kept me awake all night. The Holloway fortune began with my grandfather, Edward. The official family history says he was a brilliant entrepreneur who built an empire from the ground up. The truth is far uglier. He stole the initial patents that formed the basis of Holloway Industries from his business partner, a man named Carter Maxwell. When Maxwell threatened to expose him, he disappeared. His body was never found. My father, Richard, inherited not just the company, but the secret of its origins. And when he married my mother, he shared that secret with her. I don't know if he ever realized what a mistake that would be. When Dad died, supposedly of a heart attack, I was only 22. Daniel was 19. Too young to take over the company, according to the board. So Mom stepped in. Temporarily, she said. But she never stepped down. I didn't find out until years later that she had been having an affair with Dad's doctor. The same doctor who signed his death certificate without an autopsy. There was never any proof. Just whispers. Suspicions. But I've never forgotten the look in her eyes at the funeral. Not grief. Relief. The words still sent a chill down my spine. Could it be true? Had Margaret been involved in her husband's death? Had she orchestrated everything to gain control of the company? It seemed too fantastical, too twisted to be real. And yet, the cold hatred in Margaret's eyes, the ruthless determination in her threat. I could believe she was capable of almost anything. And now she had declared war on me. I reached for my phone, my decision made. If Margaret wanted a fight, I would give her one. Not for the money or the assets, I had never cared about those things. But for James. For the truth he had wanted me to know. I dialed Daniel's number, my resolve strengthening with each ring. Daniel? I need your help. It's about your mother, and about what really happened to your father. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. As I hung up, I felt something inside me harden. The grieving widow was still there, her heart shattered by James's loss. But beside her now stood someone else, someone determined to uncover the truth, no matter how ugly. Margaret Holloway had no idea who she was dealing with. Daniel arrived with a haunted look in his eyes. We sat at my kitchen table, the tension between us thick enough to slice with a knife. How much do you know? He asked, his voice strained. I pushed James's letter across the table. Everything he wrote here. About your grandfather. Your father. I hesitated. About what your mother might have done. Daniel read the letter, his face growing paler with each paragraph. When he finished, he set it down with shaking hands. "I've suspected," he said quietly. "For years. But I never had proof." "Do you think it's true? About your father?" He didn't answer immediately, his gaze distant. "Mom changed after Dad died. Became harder. More controlling. At the time, I thought it was grief. Now." He shook his head. "I don't know what to believe anymore." I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine. "James wanted me to know. He wanted the truth to come out. And look where it got him," Daniel said bitterly. "Dead before his 35th birthday." A chill ran through me at his words. "What are you saying, Daniel? You don't think that Mom had something to do with James getting sick?" He laughed, the sound hollow and pained. "No. Even she wouldn't go that far. But cancer was convenient for her. It meant she kept control of the company. James was too sick to fight her. But he fought her in the end," I said. "By leaving everything to me." Daniel's gaze sharpened, his expression suddenly intent. "Yes. He did." He leaned forward. "Do you understand what that means, Rebecca? What you now control?" I thought about the document Margaret had tried to force me to sign. About the fury in her eyes when I refused. "Holloway Industries," I said slowly. "The family fortune. More than that. You control the board now. You have the power to launch an investigation into everything, including Dad's death." The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about money. It was about justice. About uncovering secrets that had been buried for decades. "That's why she's so desperate," I murmured. "She's afraid of what might come out." Daniel nodded grimly. "Mom will do anything to maintain control. Anything. You need to be prepared." "For what?" "For whatever she throws at you. Lawsuits. Accusations. Character assassination." He paused, his expression dark. "Or worse." I thought about the cold determination in Margaret's eyes earlier that morning. About the threat in her voice. "You'll regret this." "I'm not afraid of her," I said, and was surprised to find it was true. "You should be," Daniel replied. "But I'll help you. For James. For Dad." After he left, I sat alone in the kitchen, James's letter in front of me. The truth it contained was like a live wire, dangerous and electric. If released, it would destroy not just Margaret, but potentially the entire Holloway legacy. Was that what James had wanted? For me to burn it all down? No. He wanted the truth. Justice for his father. Accountability for the secrets that had poisoned his family for generations. My phone chimed with a text. "Daniel. Check your email. Sending you something you need to see." I opened my laptop, finding his message waiting. The subject line sent a chill down my spine. Evidence. Dad's death. Attached was a scanned document, an original draft of Richard Holloway's death certificate with notes from the coroner indicating suspicious elevated levels of digoxin, a heart medication Richard hadn't been prescribed. Notes that had been absent from the final, official death certificate. At the bottom of the email, Daniel had written, "Found this in James's personal safe at the office. He'd been collecting evidence. There's more. Be careful, Becca. If Mom finds out what we know." I stared at the document, a cold certainty settling in my stomach. This was proof. Not conclusive, perhaps, but enough to raise serious questions. Questions that Margaret Holloway would do anything to keep buried. Almost as if summoned by my thoughts, my phone rang. "Margaret." I answered, my voice steady. "Yes?" "I've filed to contest the will," she said without preamble. "My lawyers tell me we have a strong case for undue influence. After all, James was on heavy medications when he made those changes. Hardly in his right mind." "Is that why you're calling? To threaten me again?" She laughed, the sound chilling in its confidence. "No, dear. I'm calling to make you one last offer before things get really unpleasant. $1 million. Walk away. Start fresh somewhere far from here. And if I refuse? Then I'll destroy you," she said simply. "I'll make sure everyone in this town knows you took advantage of my dying son. I'll challenge every decision you try to make regarding the company. I'll tie you up in legal battles until you're drained, financially and emotionally." I thought about the document Daniel had sent. About James's letter. About the truth that Margaret was so desperate to keep hidden. "You're afraid," I said, the realization dawning. "Not of losing the money. Of what James knew. Of what he told me." The silence on the other end was deafening. "I don't know what you're talking about," she finally said, but the confidence had seeped from her voice. "I think you do. I think you're terrified that James didn't just leave me his assets. He left me the truth about what happened to his father. About what you did." "You're hysterical," Margaret snapped. "Grief has clearly affected your mind." "The offer is rejected," I said calmly. "And Margaret? You should be the one afraid. Because I'm not going anywhere." I hung up before she could respond, my heart pounding but my resolve stronger than ever. The game had changed. Margaret thought she was fighting to protect her fortune, her status. But I was fighting for something far more precious, the truth James had died trying to uncover. And I would not rest until justice was served. The next morning, I received a call from Mr. Daniels, the lawyer. "Rebecca, there's been a development. Margaret Holloway has filed an injunction to prevent you from accessing any Holloway assets until the will contest is settled." I'd been expecting this. Margaret's opening move in what would undoubtedly be a protracted battle. "What does that mean, practically speaking?" "It means your bank accounts, the house, the company shares, everything is frozen for now. You won't be able to sell, transfer, or substantially modify any of the assets." I thought about the modest savings account in my own name, from before I married James. It wasn't much, but it would keep me afloat for a while. How long will the injunction last? Until a judge rules on it. Could be weeks, could be months. He paused. "I should warn you, Rebecca, Margaret has hired Clayton Reed to represent her." The name meant nothing to me. And that's bad because Reed is ruthless. Known for his scorched earth approach to family law. He'll dig into every aspect of your life, looking for anything he can use against you. A tendril of fear coiled in my stomach, but I pushed it away. "Let them look. I have nothing to hide." "I hope that's true," Mr. Daniels said gravely. "For your sake. I'll file a counter-motion today, but you should prepare for a long fight." After hanging up, I sat at the kitchen table, considering my next move. The freeze on assets was inconvenient but not crippling. I had enough to live on for a while, and I had no intention of touching James's money anyway, not until this was over. But I needed allies. People who knew the truth about the Holloway family. People who might have information that could help my case. I pulled out my phone and called the one person who might have inside knowledge about Margaret's machinations. Teresa? It's Rebecca Holloway. I need your help. Teresa Davis had been the Holloway family's housekeeper for over 30 years. She'd served Richard until his death, then continued working for Margaret. If anyone knew the family's secrets, it would be her. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop across town, away from prying eyes. When I arrived, Teresa was already there, her weathered hands clutched around a mug of tea. "Mrs. Holloway, Rebecca," she said, her voice hushed as I slid into the seat across from her. "I'm so sorry about James. He was a good man." "Thank you, Teresa. And thank you for meeting me." She glanced nervously around the cafe. "I shouldn't be here. If Mrs. Holloway found out." "I know I'm asking a lot," I said gently. "But I need to understand what's happening." "James left me a letter. He said his mother might have been involved in his father's death." Teresa's face paled, and she clutched her mug tighter. "I can't. I shouldn't talk about that. Please, Teresa." James wanted the truth to come out. "I'm just trying to honor his wishes." The older woman's eyes filled with tears. "I love that boy. From the day he was born. Watched him grow up. Watched him suffer under her control." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And I was there the night Mr. Richard died." My heart raced. "What do you remember?" "He was fine that evening. Had dinner with Mrs. Margaret. I served them myself. They argued, not unusual, they fought often in those days. Mr. Richard threatened to divorce her, said he had evidence of her affair." She shook her head. "In the morning, he was dead. Dr. Ellison, her friend, pronounced it a heart attack. No autopsy. And you suspected something wasn't right?" Teresa's eyes darted around the cafe again. "I cleaned up their dinner things that night. Mrs. Margaret had made him his favorite drink. Bourbon. I noticed the glass smelled strange. Like almonds." She leaned in closer. "The next day, the glass was gone. I never saw it again." A chill ran down my spine. Bitter almonds, the telltale scent of cyanide. "Did you tell anyone? The police?" She laughed bitterly. "Who would believe the housekeeper over Margaret Holloway? Besides, I had no proof. Just suspicions." "And James? Did he know what you saw?" Teresa nodded slowly. "He asked me, years later. Said he had found some inconsistencies in his father's medical records. I told him what I remembered. He said he would keep investigating. That was about a year before he got sick. The implications hung heavy between us. Had James's illness truly been natural? Or had Margaret silenced her son when he got too close to the truth? "Do you think she?" I couldn't finish the question. Teresa's face crumpled. "I don't know. I pray not. But cancer, it can be induced. There are ways. And Mrs. Margaret knows powerful people. Doctors. Scientists." The thought was too horrible to contemplate. That Margaret might have poisoned not just her husband, but her own son to protect her secrets. "Is there anyone else who might know something?" I asked. "Anyone who was close to Richard or Margaret back then?" Teresa hesitated, then reached into her purse. She pulled out a faded photograph and pushed it across the table. "Dr. Ellison. The one who signed the death certificate. He and Mrs. Margaret were involved. For years. Even before Mr. Richard died." I studied the photo. A handsome man with salt and pepper hair stood beside a younger Margaret, their body language intimate even in the formal setting of what appeared to be a charity gala. Is he still around? Last I heard, he retired to Florida. But he still comes to town for the Holloway Foundation events. There's one next month. The annual gala. A plan began to form in my mind. Thank you, Teresa. This helps more than you know. She reached across the table, grasping my hand with surprising strength. Be careful, Rebecca. Mrs. Margaret is dangerous when cornered. And right now, she sees you as a threat to everything she's built. I will be. And Teresa? If you ever decide you want to tell this story officially, to the police, to a lawyer, I'll protect you. She nodded, though her expression remained doubtful. Just find the truth. For James. For Mr. Richard. As I walked back to my car, I felt a cold determination settling over me. James had spent his final years searching for evidence of his father's murder. He had passed that mission to me, along with the means to complete it. Margaret thought she was fighting to protect her wealth, her status. What she didn't realize was that she was fighting against the ghost of her dead son, and the wife he had carefully prepared for this very battle. I pulled out my phone, dialing Daniel's number. I need your help getting into the annual gala next month. There's someone I need to meet. The Holloway Foundation annual gala was the social event of the season. Held at the Grand Alexandria Hotel, it attracted the city's elite, politicians, business leaders, old money families, all gathering to support the foundation's charitable endeavors while showcasing their wealth and status. In previous years, I had attended on James's arm, enduring Margaret's thinly veiled disdain and the pitying glances of the society matrons who viewed me as the husband's unfortunate choice. This year, I arrived alone, wearing a sleek black dress that James had bought me for our last anniversary. A small act of defiance, a reminder that I was still his widow, still connected to him despite Margaret's attempts to erase me. Daniel met me at the entrance, handsome in his tuxedo, offering his arm with a reassuring smile. Ready for this? He asked, his voice low. Mother will be livid when she sees you. Good, I replied, slipping my arm through his. Let her be. We moved through the glittering crowd, accepting glasses of champagne from passing waiters. I felt the stares, heard the whispers. The scandal of James's will had been the talk of the town for weeks. There she is. The widow. Can you believe Margaret's own son left everything to her? Must have been manipulated. Gold digger. Opportunist. I held my head high, ignoring the whispers, scanning the room for my target, Dr. Ellison. Daniel spotted him first. Over by the bar. Gray hair, bow tie. Dr. Robert Ellison had aged since the photo Teresa had shown me, but was still distinguished looking, his posture military straight as he sipped his drink. I'll create a distraction, Daniel murmured. Give you a chance to approach him alone. Before I could respond, Margaret materialized before us, resplendent in a deep burgundy gown that accentuated her still enviable figure. Her eyes glittered with barely contained fury as she took in the sight of her younger son escorting me. Daniel. What a surprise to see you with her. She spat the last word like it was poison on her tongue. Daniel's grip on my arm tightened slightly. Mother. You look lovely tonight. Don't patronize me, she hissed, her gaze shifting to me. And you. You have some nerve showing up here. This is a Holloway family event. I am family, I said quietly. James's widow, remember? A flush of anger stained her cheeks. Not for long. My lawyers assure me the will contest will be resolved in my favor. Quite soon, in fact. Is that so? I kept my voice level, refusing to be baited. Well, until then, I believe I have as much right to be here as anyone. Her eyes narrowed. Enjoy it while it lasts, my dear. Your little charade is coming to an end. With that, she swept away, immediately surrounded by sympathetic friends eager to console her over the indignity of my presence. Well, that went better than expected, Daniel said dryly. She didn't have you thrown out. Yet, I replied. I should talk to Dr. Ellison before she notices. Daniel nodded, squeezing my arm before releasing it. I'll run interference. Good luck. I made my way to the bar, positioning myself next to Dr. Ellison as I ordered a fresh glass of champagne. Lovely event, isn't it? I said conversationally. He turned, his gaze assessing as it swept over me. Indeed. Though I don't believe we've met. Robert Ellison. Rebecca Holloway. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Ah. James's widow. I was sorry to hear about his passing. A fine young man. Thank you. I took a sip of my champagne, carefully considering my next words. Did you know him well? Since he was a boy. I was the family physician for many years. His expression clouded briefly. I attended to his father as well, before his unfortunate passing. Yes, Richard's heart attack, I said, watching his reaction closely. Very sudden, wasn't it? A barely perceptible tensing of his shoulders was the only indication that my question had unsettled him. These things often are, he replied smoothly. Cardiac events can strike without warning. How interesting, then, that the preliminary coroner's report noted elevated levels of digoxin. Especially since Richard wasn't prescribed any heart medication. The champagne glass in his hand trembled slightly. I'm not sure where you heard that, Mrs. Holloway, but... Please, Dr. Ellison. Let's not pretend. I leaned in, lowering my voice. I know about your relationship with Margaret. I know you signed Richard's death certificate without an autopsy. What I don't know is whether you were an active participant in his murder, or merely complicit in covering it up. His face had gone gray, the practiced composure of a moment ago vanished. You have no idea what you're talking about, he hissed. These are dangerous accusations. Not accusations. Questions. The same questions James was asking before he got sick. Dr. Ellison's gaze darted around the room, no doubt searching for Margaret. What do you want from me? The truth. For James. For his father. He laughed bitterly, his eyes suddenly weary beyond their years. The truth? After all this time? He took a long sip of his drink, fortifying himself. You're either very brave or very foolish, Mrs. Holloway. Before he could say more, there was a commotion across the room. Margaret had collapsed, clutching her chest, gasping for air. As people rushed to help her, Dr. Ellison's expression changed from fear to grim resolution. 2 weeks later, I stood by Margaret's hospital bed, watching her diminished form struggle to breathe. The stroke had left her paralyzed, unable to speak, but her eyes still burned with awareness, with rage. The board voted this morning, I told her quietly. They've approved an independent investigation into Richard's death. Dr. Ellison has agreed to testify. She couldn't respond, couldn't threaten or manipulate anymore. Justice for Richard, and for James, was finally within reach. As I turned to leave, I felt James's presence beside me, guiding me toward the light that awaited beyond Margaret's shadows. The truth his letter had revealed had set us both free,